Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second TeTra Lecture of the year, which will take our seminar further west than it's actually ever gone before. Our guide today will be Professor Emeritus Margaret Cormack. She has been a trusted participant in our seminar for more than 2 years now, even though we've never really come close to addressing any topic that has directly related to the subjects that she researches. So it's therefore with great pleasure that I will now introduce her to you. She's a professor emerita of the Department of Religious Studies at the College of Charleston. Until last year, she was affiliate professor in the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Iceland. And since her retirement also, she's been a guest researcher at the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies. She obtained a BA in Linguistics and Germanic Languages from Harvard University. In 1974, a diploma of medieval studies from the University of St. Andrews in 1976, and an MPhil in medieval studies from Yale. In between, she also found the time to study Old and Modern Icelandic at the University of Iceland. And it was also from Yale that she obtained a PhD in medieval studies, with a dissertation on the saints in Iceland, the first 4 centuries, which was published as The Saints in Iceland, Their Veneration from the Conversion to 1400, in the series Subsidia Hagiographica in 1994. Ever since then, she has held positions in Germany, Iceland, at Yale, Harvard, Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and the University of Massachusetts, until she became professor at the College of Charleston, where she remained until her retirement in 2017. Since then, she hasn't sat still, teaching in the MA program in Viking and Medieval Norse Studies at the University of Iceland, and taking up a position as affiliate professor in the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Iceland. Discussing her many publications on the medieval history and literature and hagiography of Iceland will take us too far, so I'll just mention 3 forthcoming articles on the cult of St. Olaf in Iceland, on Ireland and its saints in medieval Icelandic cultural memory, and on the sagas of Gudmundur Arason. Last year, she published an article on St. Celia's Icelandic miracles, and the year before that, articles on the cult of Thomas Becket and on the veneration of St. Michael in Iceland, as well as an English translation of the saga of John of Holar. One of her current projects is a study of medieval Icelandic ecclesiastical charters and the Cartularies, about which she will be enlightening us today. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I am now hitting share. Okay, I think, okay. Have you got my screen? Yes, has that worked?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so, and Reykjavik is now covered up, or I misspelled it by all of your faces. I'd like to begin just by thanking the TeTra group for this invitation to discuss my research, which is focused quite far from their area of greatest concern. I feel like I should begin with Monty Python by saying, and now for something completely different. I will in fact start with some really basic historical background. Iceland was discovered and settled primarily from Scandinavia, but with a strong component from the Northern British Isles, probably in the 9th century. The population would, for the most part, have been pagan, but there would have been a certain number of Christians, and many people would have been familiar with Christianity. Iceland was not a part of Norway until it accepted the rule of the King of Norway in the second half of the 13th century. However, pressure from the then King of Norway may have been a factor in the adoption of Christianity in the year 999. The conditions of acceptance of Christianity were everybody should be baptized, paganism was punishable, but people could sacrifice in secret if they wanted to, as long as nobody came with a legal case about it. Infant exposure was permitted, and horses could be eaten. All of this was changed by the time of the first recorded provisions of what is called the Christian law, part of the Icelandic law code dated 1222 to 33. It states, "It is the first precept of our laws that all people in this country must be Christian and put their trust in one God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Every child that is born is to be brought for baptism at the first opportunity, however deformed it may be." That takes care of the infant exposure. Just by way of comparison, the earliest Norwegian laws, which are a bit before this one, actually allow you to bring a badly deformed newborn that has no chance of ever living a normal life to the church, getting it baptized, and just leaving it there until it dies. So this is what that first precept about every child being brought for baptism is perhaps reacting against. Okay, men are to put their trust in one God and his saints and are not to worship heathen beings. And I did not find the direct quote, but only Latin-speaking priests are allowed to hold services in Iceland. As some of you may know, there were Armenian and also probably Greek, but possibly Russian Orthodox priests, possibly bishops in Iceland in the 10th century. Okay, Iceland was originally a single diocese, receiving its first bishop in 1056 with an episcopal see at Skálaholt. A second see was created at Hólar in northern Iceland in 1106. This is shortly after the creation of the Archdiocese of Lund in Sweden, now Denmark, for all of Scandinavia. Previously, Scandinavia had been part of the Archdiocese of Hamburg-Bremen. I'm sorry, I missed the slide there. Okay, in 1152, a new archdiocese was created at Nidaros, now Trondheim in Norway, comprising Norway, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe, Shetland, and Orkney Islands, as well as the Scottish Islands, the Hebrides, and Isle of Man. Remember, that was also area where Vikings settled. Iceland accepted the rule of the King of Norway in the latter half of the 13th century. There was also a lot of ecclesiastical power concentration at about that time. The Norwegian and Danish thrones were combined in 1397, and Iceland was ruled from Copenhagen until 1944. The Reformation, when Catholicism was rejected and Lutheranism accepted, was made obligatory to all subjects of the Danish king in 1536. It can be dated to 1540 in Skálaholt, which received its first Lutheran bishop in that year, and 1550 in Hólar, when the Catholic bishop there was executed. For convenience, we usually use the latter date for the whole country when referring to the Reformation. So for the purpose of this paper, we're talking about an island divided into two dioceses here, Hólar in the north, Skálaholt in the south. And just so you know, this line across the middle of the country is something of an imaginary line because nobody lived there. This is all desert and mountains and glaciers and whatnot. People live around the edges of the island, the very sparse population consisting of farms, no towns, not even villages. Basically, on this map, it doesn't show very well. Sometimes you can see sort of a nice bright green around the edges. The green does not mean agriculture. There was probably a little bit of agriculture in the initial settlement when the temperature was a bit warmer, but later on, people lived mostly off livestock, cattle, and sheep. Iceland, this is just by the by. Iceland had two native saints canonized at Skálaholt 1198. That's Thorlákur and Björn in Hólar in 1200, and neither of them was canonized at the National Assembly. This is something you see repeatedly in books about Christianization, and it is nonsense. They were canonized locally in a fashion which was a little bit behind the times, but still legal at the time that it happened. However, by the time they wanted to promote the sanctity of a third saint, Gudmundur Arason, in the 14th century, it was necessary to get papal permission, and they never managed to do this. The sort of official cutoff date for canon law, when you absolutely need papal permission before you can canonize anyone, is 1247. Also, another piece of miscellaneous information, a saga is a vernacular narrative prose text about a person or people. Maybe some of you have heard of Njál's saga, which is the most famous one. The term can also be used to translate Latin vita of a saint. And in the Máldagar, which I am about to tell you about, the language of the title is presumed to reflect the language of the volume it is in the title of. So where you would, if it's in Latin, it will be Vita Martini. If it's in Icelandic, it will be Martein's saga, in both cases meaning the life of Saint Martin. Okay, so that's your basic background. Now, in that law code of 1222 to 33, there's a very important provision for my purposes, which reads as on the slide. If anyone endows a church with property, whether it is land or livestock or chattels or in tithes from farms where people of the district are directed to pay tithes to that church, then the man who has charge of the church is to have the whole agreement made in a deed or charter, Maldagi is the word they use, listing what property he or other men of the district have given to the church. It is lawful for them to take that agreement to the assembly to publish at the Lögberg or in the law council or at the spring assembly to which he belongs, whatever property the church has been endowed with. He is to have the Maldagi read out and the agreement published at home at the church once every 12 months when most people attend service there. So what this means is you have a running record of all the property of any sort owned by that church, which is going to be read aloud to the congregation whenever the congregation is reckoned to be biggest. All of the original churches would have been proprietary churches, Eigenkirchen. I'm sorry, I don't know why there's a B at the end of Eigenkirchen, shouldn't be there. Built and run by the landowners. This led to the conflict that I mentioned in the late 13th century, the so-called Staðarmál, when the Bishop of Skálholt in particular wanted to gain control of the churches. It was finally decided in 1297 that if the church owned more than half of the farm on which it stood, the church was a benefice whose control was granted by the bishop. If the church owned less than half the farm on which it stood, the landowner continued in control of it and its property. And I think the best way to understand a Maldagi is to actually look at one. So I'm going to start with one that is connected with a very famous individual, Snorri Sturluson, who lived 1179 approximately to 1241, was a chieftain, a law speaker, historian, poet, mythographer. He's the one who, when you read books about Scandinavian mythology, they ultimately nearly all go back, about 80% I would estimate, to writings of Snorri Sturluson. And he lived at a place now called Reykholt, but formerly called Reykjaholt, between 1206 and 41. And the reason that I'm going to call it Reykholt and not correctly in the old pronunciation, Reykjaholt, is because Reykholt is what you see on the modern map here. And it's just much easier to use modern pronunciation of words that are still there in that pronunciation on maps. Okay, this is the Maldagi itself. As you can see, it's not in great shape. It was probably originally the page of some kind of liturgical book. That would be something that you would want to keep in your church. It would be a holy book and a safe place to keep important documents, not between the pages, but as part of the book itself. It has been analyzed paleographically, and 7 hands have been identified. On this rather crummy slide, you can sort of see where I have marked in red the differences between the various hands. And this, by the way, this is the facsimile edition of this document. And Guðvarður Már Gunnlaugsson is the one who analyzed the handwriting in it. So everything I have to say about handwriting is by him. Okay, the easiest thing to do is to look at the different hands in the English translation. So this is hand 1. It deals with the land, boundaries, fishing rights, livestock, and so on and so forth, written sometime before 1208. To the church in Reykholt belongs the home farm with all its produce. And we get 5 parts of Grímsá, but 3 are excluded. This is a river, there's a flood wall, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all of the details here. We have fishing rights, we have mountain pasturage, we have woods. And the boundaries of the woods are very carefully described, so we will know exactly where this area is that is defined in the land of this woodland that belongs to the church. Hand 2 starts talking about the church ornaments. Books, vestments, 2 bells which have not been valued, and inserted above the line after the word ornaments in a later hand is 1,206 ounces. This is a form of currency, which I can discuss later. I've got a slide about it, but I don't think you need to know it now. A velvet chasuble, not appraised, which Ormur Bjarnason gave in books and investments and in church ornaments. Then the main text continues, Magnus and Hallfríður gave to, sorry, there's a repetition there, the church a rude cross and images that are above the altar and the cover for a planarium. This is the church's property, and so on and so forth. To the church belong Breiðabólstaður and Reykjadal. These are farms, and 7 kugildi, again, a unit of value worth of valuables. Now, this is where it gets interesting for those who are interested in church control. The one who lives at Reykholt must look after this land and 2 kugildi of livestock. Along with the property goes the obligation of supporting an incapable person, a pauper, someone who cannot work for his or her own upkeep, every 6 months. And the one who lives in Reykholt shall choose him, shall choose that pauper. Gizur and Thorður and Ketil Hermundarson and Högni the priest appraised the church property, investments, and church ornaments to Snorri when the church was handed over to him. So this is when Snorri Sturluson takes over this church. They have evaluated it and how much it's all worth. A shrine containing relics on the altar was given by Magnus and Snorri, half each. And it is church property in addition to what has already been enumerated. Now, if I were to go back to the Maldagi itself, which I'm not, there is a funny little mark in the margin right here. The word shrine begins right next to the margin with a capital letter. And I would give a lot to know whether that mark in the margin is because of the shrine containing relics, and we don't know what relics they were, or because Snorri is mentioned as the donor. Could be either. Anyway, hand 2 ends there. Hand 3, in addition, the church owns the bells that Hallveig and Snorri donate to it, namely 2 song maids, and 2 bells given by Artni, and 1 given by Solmundur, and the 6th given by Peter, and vestments of the highest quality, 2 enamel crosses, and an image. Again, we're not told who the image is of. St. Peter, that would be a good guess, but we don't know. Finally, hand 4, and this really looks as if someone stuck it in at the very bottom of the page. The church at Reykholt has the following drift rights. meaning the right to collect driftwood that washes up on the shore. If you remember the map, Reykholt is not particularly near to any shores. So these are drift rights on the shore at some distance from Reykholt. And what do they get? What's important that washes up on the shore? A third of the beach whales and half of the driftwood and half of the land at Ytrafell. Then at a place called Inrafell, a third of the beach whales and similar as below Ytrafell, and a third of the profit of each. At Munatharnes, a quarter of the beached whales. At Camber, a quarter of the beached whales. In Birgisvik, a quarter of the beached whales. So what is all this about whales? Well, stop and think about it. Whales are, even small ones, relatively large animals and a big source of protein. They are edible. And those of you who have read some of the more traditional sagas about Icelanders may be aware that there are often big fights about precisely beached whales and who gets how much whale. They are very valuable. As to wood, in Iceland, such trees as grow are relatively small, and large trunks of wood that arrive from Siberia, of all places, were extremely valuable when they washed up on shore. So the church has acquired the rights to collect these things at these particular locations. Okay, that's the end of the first page. If we turn it over, there's not much written here, but what is here is finally something that I am really interested in. The church that stands in Reykholt is dedicated with God to Mary, the Mother of God, and the Holy Apostle Peter, and Holy Bishop Dionysius, and Holy Virgin Barbara. But what's strange here, it looks as if this was written here to match up with these vertical lines, which are written here somewhere. However, the paleographers tell me that this hand is from the second half of the 13th century, and this hand over here is actually older, which is a mystery to me. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, the more so because of what it says, which is something, 6 calf skins. Then Snorri Sturluson, that's the man I was talking about earlier, 6 calf skins. The priest Thorin Vandreðason, 10 calf skins. The deacon Vermundur, 10 calf skins. Ingebjörg Snorradóttir, 12 calf skins. And these calf skins are, of course, for making parchment, Reykholt being a very major cultural center in the time precisely of Snorri Sturluson, who is doing all kinds of writing. Okay, and there was, as I mentioned, hand 7. That was just the insertion concerning Ormur Bjarnason's gift earlier on. That got put in between the lines. But when this Maldagi is copied over into a cartulary, such as this one here, which I'm going to talk about, then certain changes are made. Instead of just the church at Reykholt, it is Peter's church at Reykholt. They don't mention the Virgin Mary or Dionysius or Barbara, just the first and most important saint. They incorporate Ormur's gift. He's no longer between the lines. It's been nicely added in where it belongs with the other gifts. And that woodland, whose borders are so very carefully outlined, no longer has its borders outlined. It's simply called Peter's Woods, because St. Peter is the owner of the church, which owns the woods, and now it's evidently a well-known piece of woodland that belongs to St. Peter and gets its own place name. So that's what happens in the course of time as Máldagar are copied and recopied. And this is important because the Reykholt Máldagi is one of the very, very few original ones that has survived. Before I go ahead, I should I should say one or two things about what's missing from it. What we do not find in that Máldaga is any mention of how many priests were supposed to serve the church. There is a priest there, clearly, he's mentioned in it, but we are not told how much, how many priests are supposed to be maintained from the estate, priests, not to mention possible deacons. There is that omagi, that dependent person. We are not told what the priest is paid. We are not told what masses are supposed to be celebrated. We are not told what farms are obligated to pay tithes to the church at Reykholt. And these are all things that are regularly included in 14th century Máldaga. Okay, so back to this document in front of me. Since, as I say, the original Máldaga mostly have not survived, what we have to use are instead the bishop's books, their Cartularies, in which they recorded the Máldaga from the church. And when your church Máldaga has added on a gift, they would record that gift in their books as well. So they're making sure that everything that is in the church is still in the church where it's supposed to be. For the Diocese of Hólar, we are actually quite well off for Cartularies. There are two medieval Cartularies which have survived, one from the late 15th century and another from 1525. There are also really good 17th century copies of Cartularies, because even though the Reformation has happened and Catholic theology is no good anymore, property is not theology. And the church wanted to keep track of the property that individual churches owned. And they continued to go on visitations and check off things against the Cartularies for many, many years after the Reformation. For the Diocese of Skolholt, we are not so lucky. A succession of fires at the cathedral means that many important records have been lost. We have numerous paper copies of a cartulary made by Bishop Wilkin Henriksson around 1400, just before plague and other disasters caused a temporary pause in administrative activity. And this is why my book, which describes the evidence for the cult of saints in both dioceses, stops at 1400. It's a great stopping place. We have relatively good records up to then. And after that period, things are a bit more iffy. Plus, a dissertation always has to stop somewhere. There are, however, two manuscripts from Skolholt copied around 1600. One of them is AM 263 Quarto from about 1598. And the other one is this one, and it actually currently goes by the name BSS rather than BPS A21. It's from about 1601. And these two manuscripts contain Máldaga from the Catholic period. The first one, AM 263, is arranged church by church, with Máldaga of different ages copied more or less in sequence, but not always, and not very well separated from each other. I'm not going to talk about that one today. It's a whole separate can of worms. However, this one, Reykjavik National Archives BSA21, appears to contain collections from cartularies dating from before the time of Wilkin. And just to point out how the name has changed in the editions, which I'm about to talk about, it's first called D12, it's then, I don't know what this stands for, then LBS for the National Library of Iceland, then it went to BPS, and now it is BSS. So this poor manuscript has changed names and locations quite frequently in the past century or two. Now, the individual Máldaga which are contained in this manuscript have been edited. This is the Íslensk Fornbréfasafnið. That is where the individual Máldaga are edited. And while this publication is extremely valuable, we couldn't do without it, it is also a bit problematic in that the authors were a little bit over optimistic as to their ability to date the individual Máldagar and their contents. The Reykholt Máldagi, for example, appears in 2 places corresponding to hand 1 and hand 2 before being published altogether, hands 1, 2, 3, and so on. So they are interested in choosing the oldest section of the Máldagi and putting it in 1185, and the next one maybe in 1200 and something, and then the whole thing together may be in the middle of the 13th century. Now, the cross-referencing is really good. It is not impossible to work from these editions, but it's extremely tiresome. To show you, by the way, I skipped over this, to show you what the contents look like, these are my cell phone shots of the various pages, and all of these titles that you can see here, those are Máldagar of different churches. Furthermore, there are these blank pages here and there. And those blank pages are very important because an Icelandic scholar called Sveinbjörn Rapnsson has analyzed this manuscript based on the divisions formed by blank pages and parts of pages. So if a Máldagi stops halfway down the page and there's enough space to write another Máldagi if you wanted to, but it's blank, that is presumably significant regarding the exemplar that was used in creating this manuscript. So Sveinbjörn went through the whole thing. I believe he has an edition, but it has not appeared, and I doubt that it's actually going to. He very kindly allowed me 40 years or so ago to have a copy of his analysis. And he went through all of these Máldagar, and you see we're talking about 130, not pages, but 130 folios, recto and verso, and tried to figure out what time period they were from. He divided them up into 3 groups. And one group he dates to the episcopate of Árni Thorláksson, 1269 to 98, another group to Jón. And the trouble is there are 3 Bishop Jóns in the middle of the 14th century, so we don't know exactly which, but this could be between 1322 and 48. And finally, there's Gyrðr Ivarsson from 1349 to 60. And Máldagar belonging to all these periods are contained in that manuscript. Now, what I did, and this is 40 years ago when I'm writing my dissertation, I was very skeptical that one could date something to a specific bishop, just based on the contents if the bishop was not mentioned. However, I went through and I checked the individual Máldagar, which often appear in different sections of the manuscript. So you'll find the same church appearing in maybe 2 or 3 times in that manuscript, where the copyist around 1600 has been copying different existing cartularies of different bishops. And indeed, these ones here are older than these ones, are older than these ones. You can see the property accumulating from here to here to here. So that was enough for me to know when I was looking primarily at saints' cults. However, notice that there's sort of a problem. This is not all nice and neat. The beginning of the document, folios 1R to 27V, are the Jón section from the mid-14th century. So that's all nice and even. But 24V is here. 26 and 27 are from the time of Árni Thorláksson. 28 to 50 are from Gyrðr. 52 to 80 are from Árni. 89 to 100 are from Gyrðr. Whoops. 100 to 107 Artney, 107 Girður. Now there is actually, there are about 20 folios missing. That is because the material between 107 and 127 are either much later than 1400, or they are copies of Máldagar that have already appeared earlier in the manuscript. So for my purposes, when I was originally thinking about these things, I simply left those out as being irrelevant. Now, of course, I'm going to look at them very carefully. Anyway, that is sort of the material that I have to work with. And what I am trying to figure out is, first of all, are there distinctive structures in the Máldagar or in the Cartularies of individual bishops which might help to date them? And secondly, do the structure and content of the Máldagar provide evidence pertinent to the struggle for control of Icelandic churches during the second half of the 13th century? Okay, I think one of the things I need to do clearly is to think about those jumps back and forth between the various bishops. Something that I don't think has been examined. Sveinbjörn Rapinson is still alive, so I will ask him and maybe go and reread his introduction if he will let me do that, is how the geography is affected by this. Is the person who puts together these, the Cartulary of 1601, is he going geographically around the country? Is he collecting Máldagar from different places and putting them together? What exactly is he doing? I have no results regarding that so far. So I think what I'm going to do now is pause for a moment, have a cup of tea, have a sip of tea, and if any of you have questions now, please feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I have one more document that we could look at and compare with the Reykholt Máldagi.
Yes, so thank you very much. If you have questions, you can raise your electronic hands or wave. We will hopefully see you. And
okay, and will you call on the people for questions, because I'm not seeing chat?
Yeah,
so
sure. Yeah.
Maybe,
we have one.
Okay.
Rosemary Power, please.
Hi, Rosemary.
Thanks very much, Meg. This one is completely tangential to your main argument. I've forgotten who it was. I think it was a Thurida, a Snorradottir, who got 12 calf skins. Are you suggesting that she had her own vellum making workshop?
I doubt that very much. Why all these people had calfskins in the first place is a very interesting question. Mm-hmm. They may have just gone off and bought some calfskins in order to give them to the church. Now, I, of course, referred to Snorri's activity because it's well known that he produced such a lot of writing about mythology and history and so on and so forth. However, since the calfskin is being given to the church, one might indeed think that actually these calfskins are intended for liturgical books.
Yeah.
One of the really frustrating things about the Máldagar for Skálholt, aside from the fact that they're hard to get at, is the fact that they just say books worth, 200 or a book worth 6 euro or something like that. In Hólar, they list every single book. It's really nice. In Skálholt, they don't.
Yes, because
I'd really like to know what they are.
Well, based on, I assume, 4 large pages per calf, if it was all given in bulk, the ones you mentioned, you could get a fairly decent plenarium out of them, couldn't you?
Yeah.
All given together or near enough for the same scribe, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep, thank you. Do we have other questions on what was just presented before we move on to the other document? Maybe I can just jump in real quick just to have an idea, because as you know, this is super fascinating for us, but quite far from what we are usually working on or with, about the measure units that you mentioned. Just to have an idea, are we talking about a lot? Was it a rich church or?
Yes, it's extremely rich.
Okay.
And here is what I put together about currency. The basic unit is homespun cloth, and an ell of homespun is the equivalent. So here we have 120 ells, or equivalent of 1 kugildi, which is a cow value. And then, yes, we do have a certain amount of silver, an ounce of silver and a mark of silver, and so on and so forth. So we do have international currency. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you actually see that? I think my screen,
no, we can't see
is paused. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Resume share. Okay, so sorry. Let me just go down to the very bottom of this again. Yeah, there we are. Can you see that currency and values?
Yes, it's not full screen, but we can see it.
Okay, I will try and get back to the proper format in a minute. But yeah, this is a very well-to-do church. And this is probably one of the reasons that Snorri wanted to get a hold of it. Snorri is, along with, chieftain, law speaker, et cetera, had I wanted to be snide, I could have added miser and womanizer. But I figured that was a little bit much to put on a PowerPoint. He had a reputation for liking money, and he had a reputation for liking women, and he would want a valuable estate. So yeah, this is a very rich church. Some other churches have much less in terms of endowment, maybe a couple of hundreds rather than a farm. And in some of them, it will tell you that the church owns a prästskuld, a priest's sort of value almost. That's not quite the right word. But the point is that they're just saying that a priest is going to be supported by this church, and they are obligated to do that. But the document itself isn't going to commit itself as to the actual value in currency, which that is, just that the priest has to be there and has to be paid.
Great, thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you. There is another question from still from Rosemary Power.
Okay.
I'm sorry to be a nuisance, Meg. I should know the answer to this one. Is you mentioned the donation of wax, which presumably was imported, as I don't understand that beekeeping was not possible at the time in Iceland, and therefore this presumably like liturgical wine, of course, would be extremely valuable in terms of the internal church economy.
As well as incense.
Oh dear, yes.
Yeah. And the thing is, when they started excavating at Gausar and at Hólar, they came up with all sorts of stuff. They came up with wine, they came up with silk, wax, incense, you name it. So the well-to-do in Iceland were, they're probably not the equivalent of the aristocracy on the mainland, but they are certainly living a lifestyle better than your average farmer.
Do we know where the wax came from or how it was valued in currency terms?
Not offhand. I could, that would be an interesting sort of MA thesis for somebody to go through the diplomatarium and check all the references to wax and try and figure out how much they were worth. I really don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you both. If there's no other pressing question, maybe we can move on and then resume the Q&A after the second part.
Okay, so here is the other Maldagi. And this is for a church that is actually not very far from Reykholt. It's further inland at Husafet. And here, and Brandur Thorarinsson is a person that we actually have reference to in other documents. And here we have some of the things that were not mentioned in the Reykholt Maldagi. So it is the Maldagi, here meaning contract rather than the piece of parchment, of the church at Husafet that Brandur Thorarinsson donates to the church, the land of Husafet, and other land that accompanies it, with all the produce that accompanies the land. 5 cows, 30 ewes, 120 4L ounces worth of equipment for house and farm. There shall always be a resident priest there. Matins and mass sung every holy day. Mass sung there every day when there are 9 lections in matins. So there's a list of holy days of obligation in the law code, but evidently if you want to add a few holy days, if there are 9 lections in matins, then you have to sing mass. And I should add at this point that one of the reasons this church is so interesting is that we have a story about it which says that Saint Cecilia was venerated there, even though her feast was not a holy day of obligation, but it's in fact this Brandur's mother who was really devoted to Saint Cecilia and always observed it as a holy day, even though it wasn't obligatory. And needless to say, 2 people who are very sick and are visiting and who decide to participate in fasting before the feast of Saint Cecilia get visions of her and are cured. So anyway, the things that can happen if you attend mass dutifully, even though it's not obligatory. Light shall burn. So stop and think of the Icelandic winter. It's very, very dark. And burning light throughout the winter, it doesn't even specify candles in this particular case. It could, I suppose, have been whale oil. But the point is you're keeping your church lighted all winter. You're certainly not keeping your house lighted all winter. So this, again, this is another very rich church and with great expenses. Okay, Bishop Kleingut permitted people on the farm who die there to be buried there. Now, you would possibly think it was automatic that, you know, if you're on a farm where a church is, that you would be buried, you know, you would die and you would be buried there. But evidently it's not necessarily that automatic. Okay, and here we have another omagi, another pauper who cannot support himself, one whom Brandur or his sons wish to choose out of their kindred. Okay, now Brandur shall look after this church property as long as he wishes, and then his sons as long as they wish. They may appoint someone else to manage it if they don't want to. But if they have no heirs who are capable to manage it, a man shall be chosen to manage the property from their kindred, whom the bishop who is in charge of Skálholt considers appropriate, but from their kindred. It's going to stay in the family. But the bishop is going to choose. And the one who looks after the church property shall be responsible for the church and its ornaments with respect to fire and other damage. So he's got to make sure it doesn't burn down, for example. Okay, the following wealth. So here again, that much that I just read was in volume 1 of the Diplomatarium Icelandicum. The rest of this does not appear until with the whole thing in volume 7. I think the subsequent editor would have put it in earlier. There was a change in editors. But anyway, this material is probably of the same age as the first slide. So here we have 2 cows, 3-year-old cattle, 12-year-old sheep, a 4-year-old horse, a silver chalice worth a kugildi, 6 books, worth a kugildi, meaning 6 books altogether are worth a kugildi. Again, what books we'd really like to know, but we don't. 4 kettles and a bread iron, presumably some kind of griddle, for a kugildi. 1 set of bedclothes for a kugildi. Iron household or farm objects. I'm not sure exactly what kind of objects, but this is just sort of a general reference. And also a ewe and 3 containers for a kugildi. Now, this is somewhat mixed up because the ewe, you would think, would go up here. But no, here it is among all of the bedclothes and containers. A fishing place. 100 in addition to this property, 400 worth of valuable items. And this is valuable items are here, things that you can't put an easy price on. People have to evaluate them. And then household and prime utensils. Okay, that probably belongs with the earlier bit. But then we have the priest Aumundi leaves behind. We don't know why. Possibly he moved on. I suspect that he died. But anyway, what he leaves behind is a baking iron, presumably for baking hosts for Mass, a book containing 8 saints' sagas. We only wish we knew which saints they were sagas about, and a whetstone. Also, 2 candlesticks, which he had made. So he has paid somebody to make these candlesticks. A book containing the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew has a Latin ending rather than Norse. A turf cutter and an ice chopper. 13 marks. So Rosemary, here is a possible answer to part of your question. 13 marks worth of wax and incense, but we don't know how much wax or incense that was. However, 13 marks is a fair sum. 3 sets of vestments for Mass with 4 copes, etc., etc. I left out some of the vestments in order to make the slide fit. All this property is not listed in the church Muldagi, but the church shall own it from now on. So future Muldagar would incorporate this. You know, they would put all the books together and all the farm stuff together. But notice here that in addition to the things which clearly pertain to the church, we've got all the farm equipment. And indeed, this is the sort of what's running behind these particular Muldaga. So Reykholt and this one is, it's not so much the priest and the liturgy, although this one actually makes provision for that, and it makes ample provision. That's a very, very considerable liturgy for the church. But the question is, who is looking after the property? So it's conceivable that the priest Aumundi, we know nothing about him, that he may actually have run the whole entire estate. But it's also possible that he was someone who was hired to look after the liturgy, and he had accumulated all this stuff, and then he's donating it to the church. One of the problems in later Muldaga is to figure out what has been bought out of church property for the church and what is a donation that somebody has made for the good of their soul. So that's a future issue that I didn't want to go into here. But this is the this bit about Bishop Plangur and Brandur Thorarensen looking after this church property as long as he wishes, and then his sons. This keeping of the church in the family is what the bishops in the late 13th century are going to object to. They're going to say, if the church owns the land at Husafet, then we, the bishops, should control it. And I don't recall if this is one of the particular churches that comes up in the Stadamal, but if you've got this Muldagi, then you would say, no, look here, it says that you've got to choose someone out of our kindred. So I think I will stop there and take any more questions that people may have.
Thank you. Thank you really once again for this fascinating presentation. The floor is open now for questions. So again, feel free to raise your electronic hands or type it in the chat. Yeah. Or type it in the chat. Maybe I can start with another curiosity based on your first example. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that there was some marginal signs in
yes. Just one, actually.
Yeah. How common is it?
There are lots of marginal signs in Icelandic manuscripts, which people often ignore. So, for example, well, I mean, there are all kinds of ones that are just people practicing their handwriting because they don't know how to write and they don't have paper maybe, and you can see them trying to copy out the words that they see in the document itself. However, more to the point are the signs that have some meaning. So in the other manuscript that I did not talk about, the marginal signs say Vilkins Maldagi or Old Maldagi, which is not very helpful, but it does say something. I was just looking at a manuscript which, there was a little conference here about the monastery at Helgafell, and I was looking at one of their manuscripts and looking at some of the comparable ones. And one manuscript that was about precisely this Guðmundur who I mentioned, who never actually made it to canonization, but nonetheless was considered a saint. And there are copies, so vitae, as it were. There's not an actual Latin vita. There was one eventually, but it only survives in Icelandic translation. Anyway, we know all about these things. And if you have a really good edition, and if you look down in the very bottom of the edition, you may find that, oh yes, here is a marginalia about, well, lo and behold, there were these great prayers to Guðmundur in this manuscript, which I had known nothing about. But there they are. Whoever is reading this manuscript is thinking about Guðmundur, and he's praying to Guðmundur for good things. And all kinds of little notices. So for example, there's a Latin manuscript, and these are very, very rare because they were no good after the Reformation, because they contain Catholic liturgy, so they were used for bookbinding and whatnot. But one of the ones that has survived, it's basically a Latin life of Saint Thorlákur, and in the margin, somebody has marked it into sections for liturgical reading. So it's not officially a book that was sort of written as a liturgical book, but somebody has come along later and marked it up so it can be used for that purpose. So there are all kinds of things written in the margins and in between the lines and so on and so forth that some people find more interesting than the original manuscripts. I mean, Ave Maria, you find Ave Maria, just the words, all over the place in religious manuscripts.
Thank you. Fascinating indeed. I think Valentina has the next question.
Yes, I want to join this conversation about the marginal notes, but not about the marginal notes, about the marginal information that we get from these documents. Like I saw, they mention women, for instance, or charity to the poor. How much of this material, I mean, what is the importance of this kind of information in these documents? Can they be used to reconstruct like the history on other aspects of history?
They could be used a lot more than they are. Let me just put it that way. Some people know about them, others do not. So this idea of supporting a pauper, a poor person on your farm is very, it's not found in all the churches, but it's a common form of charity. Now, there's also, so you're supposed to look after this person. There is a truly harrowing excerpt in the saga about Saint Magnus. Saint Magnus is the Earl of the Orkneys, and he had some churches dedicated to him in Iceland. And there's this one miracle in which it really looks to me like the omagi, the disabled person, has been delivered to this place and just kind of dumped there, and nobody is giving him anything to eat, which is not what's supposed to happen. The whole point is that you are looking after this poor person. But this guy just appears to be starving, and people go off somewhere, and he ends up in front of the altar of St. Magnus, and of course St. Magnus helps him out. But just the situation in which he is less than wonderful. You learn a lot about, these are now the miracle collections I'm talking about, not the Máldaga. Miracle collections often tell you about, poor people calling on the saint and getting food, for example. So Guðmundur Arason is particularly good at this. There's a great example of sort of, the stone soup story, where somebody is, it's a folktale in which somebody says he's going to make stone soup. So he gets water and puts stones in it. And he says, of course, stone soup is much better if you got a few carrots. And so somebody brings some carrots. And he says, yeah, well, it's really good if you get some potatoes. And, so he gets all this stuff, and he ends up with this really nice soup that's made out of stone, basically. So in the Icelandic version of this story, Guðmundur comes to some woman's farm, and what she has done is she has taken turf and thrown it in the pot and told her children she's making soup. But it's just to keep them quiet, to keep them from screaming. And she tells Guðmundur this, and Guðmundur says, well, that was very clever of you, my dear. And he gets the turf to turn into meat or some such thing. So he actually produces food for her. So we do get these stories of, people who really have nothing. There are stories, you often see it said that medieval people did not care for children. I don't know if this is still as much of a thing as it used to be when I was a graduate student, but it's obviously nonsense, because you hear these stories of people who are obviously harrowed by the sicknesses and problems of their children, and they pray to the saints, and the children are cured. So you do get a real insight into the lives of women and the poor. Again, not so much from the Máldaga, but from the miracle stories of the native saints. The Máldaga tell you about things about charity that people are obligated to provide, but they don't tell you how well that was carried out.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you both. I also have a couple of other questions still on the first example. The first one is really just a basic one to understand whether I got your argumentation correctly or not. You said that we don't have some information in that. We don't have the number of priests and all of this, but
very first Máldaga does not, just tells you about the property.
But it doesn't contain it because they're lost, or they were never there. They were never there.
It was never there in the first place.
Okay. And also you mentioned the fact that in one of the manuscript it has blank spaces, like blank pages, and that makes me wonder how common again is this, because for the tradition I work on, usually they have the tendency of filling every writing script, that writing support that they have, because they are expensive, so they don't want to just leave things blank. Or did I misunderstand?
Well, this certainly was the case in the Middle Ages, and it's also the case in the manuscript that I did not talk about, where the space between Máldaga is like maybe an inch. It's not even a new line. There's just this tiny little bit of space in the capital letter, and then you're on to a new document. No, in the BSS one, now this is written in about 1600, and it really does look as if someone had access to material. It's not parchment. I'm pretty sure it's a paper manuscript. I really should know this, but I'm pretty sure it is. And they were going through, and they had, sometimes booklets, sometimes just a page or two of older Máldaga, which they copy over and they do leave either a blank space at the end or sometimes an entire blank page in between each, we suppose, original and the next one. So that's really nice, but it does imply, as you say, it implies that they had plenty of material at hand. And the trouble is, because it was paper, it also was not preserved so well, which is why these things are all very messy around the edges and sometimes very hard to read.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Valentina?
Yes, that's another question from a fully outsider of these topics, but studying monasticism. So do we have the same documents for monasteries? There were hermitages or labriotic settlements? Or,
okay, there were, hang on, there were, at the time I'm talking about, 2 Benedictine monasteries, 2 Benedictine nunneries, and about 6 Augustinian houses. And the problem is that the bishops who are going around collecting these máldagar of parish churches seem to consider monasteries in a special category. So it looks like the monasteries kept their own records. For some of them, we do have material. And for one of the very early ones, this is Helgafell, and we're now talking about 1178, I think. And it's very, very similar to Húsafell in that you have somebody who is founding it, is donating land for the monastery. And when he gets too old, then there are 2 people who we assume to be his sons who are going to be in charge. And then after that, as I recall, is up to the Bishop of Skalholt to sort of look after things. But what's very interesting in that case is that they're not apparently sure that it's going to make a go as a monastery. So there's a provision that says, and if the monastery doesn't work out, then the endowment shall be used for a church with 2 priests and a deacon, and so on and so forth. But if it had been a proper monastery, there is this sort of idea that it would have been in the family of the founder, with the bishop's permission, because, it's a church is one thing, a monastery, even in those days, is a slightly different issue. But there are monasteries, there are a few hermits and hermitesses. There's an anchoress at Hólar, for example. But it's a small country with a small population, and the organizations are also small.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have another question from Professor Therese de Hentin. Please.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Do your documents allow you to know something about the chronology they use in Iceland at that time and the calendar they use?
At the time of these documents, the chronology is the standard Dionysian chronology. The question of calendar comes up in a different context. So the very first saints' lives that are written around 1200 use a different chronology by somebody called Gerlandus. And that chronology is 7 years different from the normal chronology. That lasts for a couple of years, but then after a while, people, get back in line with the rest of Europe. Also, there's a question of when the year began. And in many books, you will see that Iceland was converted to Christianity in the year 1000, which is a wonderful, nice round number. And I think that's why the author of the work in which it is mentioned liked it so much. The trouble is that he probably began the year in September. And so a date that is in, let us say, I can't remember the date, let us say September 20, for him it's in the year 1000, for us it's still 999. And there is, you know, when you look at this carefully, you realize that that's what's going on. So that wonderful, nice round number 1000 is in fact incorrect according to our chronology.
Thank you once again. And unless I'm missing some questions, please allow me to thank once again Margaret Cormack for this amazing presentation and this fascinating talk, and thank all of you for joining, and see you next time. Goodbye, y'all. Thanks.
Bye-bye, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.